Hey guys, welcome back to Star Wars Timeline. Today we have another wonderful podcast with you guys. I'm here with lovely Meg. Meg, tell us, how are you doing? How's your week has been so far?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited to be in my front room as I've been the whole time, but finally back in the proper arrangement. And I'm just continuing on with my first ever read of the Fate of the Jedi series, which is very exciting.
Oh, nice. So you're on the first book?
I'm on book number 2 now.
Nice. Yeah, I think I got as far as book number 3 back in the day, and I recently restarted it, but I need to push on with that series. But guys, today's Meg and I are going to continue our conversation about the new Jedi Order series that we've been breaking down. And very quick summarization for those of you who are seeing this video for the first time, you have no clue what this is. So the new Jedi Order was a giant publishing campaign back in the Star Wars Legends days. And it was published from 1999 to 2003, covering 19 adult books, short stories, and some novellas. And it's part of Star Wars Legends, right? It's not connected to the current Star Wars canon. And the events in those books portrayed 21 to 25 years after the events of the original movie A New Hope, where Luke Skywalker is restoring the new Jedi Order in full swing, while the galaxy is being invaded by these intergalactic invaders called the Yuzong Vong. Before we jump into our discussion, there's a couple of preliminary questions I have here, just general stuff that I think is going to relate to our book's discussion today. Meg, what are your preferred mediums for storytelling in general? You know, whether it's movies, TV show, games, books, what's your top one?
I mean, for me, usually books is my first one, especially when I hear there's a TV show or there's a movie coming out based on a book. I always go to the book first. But I do I think sometimes reading graphic novels, being able to get see what the characters look like, especially when I was reading the new Jedi Order series. I was like, oh man, if only we had children's illustrated books, we could have had everything drawn out for me, because I guess sometimes when I'm reading, I can't picture things, but then if they turn into a movie, I'll go well, that wasn't what I saw at all. And so I like graphic novels for being able to almost fill that gap of seeing what the author intended beyond if it ever is adapted for another format, and then we get, that person's interpretation instead.
That's a very interesting point, because comic books, they serve as intermediary, right, between live action and between word storytelling, where you sort of get the gist and idea of things, but you still kind of complement. Your imagination basically goes outside the boundaries of the comic book panel, and you can still say, well, maybe that background over there looks a little bit this way, or you have an action between the two Jedi, right? They're clashing lightsabers, but you're figuring out, no, this person did that jump. You still complete the picture yourself.
Yeah.
Where in the movie, I was in theaters yesterday, and when you're watching a film, basically there is no room to play around. Everything is provided to you. The picture, the sound, the dialogues, everything, right?
Yeah.
But when you're reading specifically a novel, right, a word, medium, what is the most lasting impression for you generally when you finish reading a book?
For me, usually it's characters. If I connected with the characters, then I'll remember it really well. And then usually that's my first initial thing. I'll look over my shelf and I'll be like, oh, that was the book where the guy, and he was really good at investigating, but he would go down, rabbit holes all the time, the wrong track. And then from there, I'll start to remember very specific scenes. And sometimes it will be I want to reread a book, but I don't want to reread the whole book. I just want to reread when so-and-so confronts the baddie and they face off. So I think it's characters first, and then specific scenes are what stick with me.
Yeah, and I want to add to that. It's for me, it's definitely that is the emotional component of the story, but also as a reader, you sort of craft worlds. Yeah. It's almost like Chris Nolan's, Inception, where you build these imaginative worlds. And for me, it's also what leaves a lasting impression is scenery in general. How does this world look, or these particular aliens, or a particular time of day is being described in a certain action sequence. That's some of the stuff I can date back to my reading of the original Thrawn trilogy, which I have never reread. but yet they're so memorable and such fantastic scenes. Like, for example, when Leia first encounters the Nogri, meaning on their turf, when she goes to them, it's such a memorable and evocative scene that also stays with me as well, besides the story.
Yeah.
Guys, we're going to do a quick recap where you and I have left off, and then we're going to dive in the current book. So we were discussing last time, we were talking about the Force Heretic book #1 of the trilogy called Remnant. And it was written by Sean Williams and Shane Dix, and released in February of 2003. That book continues on with the Yuzong War, and we're 28 years after Battle of Yavin. So quickly, what happened there? Just going to run through the events there. We have bearable Jedi Master Seba Sabatine. She manages to avenge her destruction of her home planet, and she liberates imprisoned compatriots with the help from Danny Q. Imperials join forces with New Alliance, score another victory at Borosk planet, and Admiral Palayan declares official union now between two parties, the Imperials and the New Alliance. Luke Skywalker, Mara Jade, and other Jedi and the scientists leave in search of the mysterious planet Xenoma Secot, or Xenoma Secot, whatever we pronounce it. Now on Coruscant, former spy Nomenor, which Meg and I both love to hate, he falls out of grace. And he is a wanted man. He infiltrates this outcast Yuzong Vong called the Shamed Ones, which dwell in the most bottom pits of the, terraformed Coruscant. And now he has a new identity called the Yusha, the false prophet. And he's plotting to revive the Jedi heresy and win back favor, possibly with Supreme Overlord, but always looking after his own interests. Now we're moving on to our current discussion today. This is book 2 of The Force Heretic, and it's called Refugee. Obviously written by the same authors, Sean Williams and Shane Dix. This one was released in May of 2003, and the events are pretty much follow right after the first book. So let's start kicking with the story, and as we go along, I'm going to have plenty of questions for you, Meg. So we begin with Nomenor's plan to infiltrate the Supreme Overlord's court, and it fails. He finds a new ally in the priestess called Ngalu, and she's the priestess of trickster goddess Yunharla. Both don't believe in the Vong War anymore, and they plan to spy on their leader and once again perpetuate their own interests, so to speak. Luke Skywalker, Mara Jade, Jason, Danny Key, and other Jedi and xenobiologist Soren Hegarty continue their search in the unknown regions of space. And they learn from local tribe of Kryzlos that the mysterious planet visited their system in the past. And they're followed by natural disasters. Luke attempts to explain the cause of those disasters, and it actually fails. There's some miscommunication going on, and the natives attack. And the party flees while their xenobiologist is severely wounded in the process. A couple of things here. What is your reaction when a seemingly reasonable people attack the noble Jedi without seeming provocation?
I think for me, it definitely showed, they're in the unknown regions, they're in unknown territory. They think that they're just on a fact-finding mission, but even just by asking around about, this planet that appears and then disappears, they sort of stoke tensions a little bit. And it also gives the authors the opportunity to create like this, open the story with this chase that they're running from these people that are trying to kill them. And it's a bit of like a alien situation, because they're like weird parasitic aliens.
Yeah.
But it definitely starts the book off with a bang.
Yeah. And I would also add that, it gives you an alternative point of view of how these Jedi, these strangers, are looked upon by aliens, by people from the unknown regions of space. They might be the heroes, shining knights in armor, where the center of the galaxy is concerned. But in these territories, they're nobodies. And, their authority means nothing. Like, why are you coming to us? Yeah. First, this planet visitation, in the, not so remote past, and it causes devastation. Are you here to bring more problem to us? What's going on here? And it's a really interesting, like, moral question. Are the Jedi always up to good, or are they also inadvertently causing some harm to people, even when they're trying to do good?
Yeah.
Was there a similar instance in the expanded universe that you can remember when heroes clashed with peaceful species?
I'm trying to think, because there's definitely been times where, you know, they land on a planet and they're not initially, getting along well with the natives who live there. But this is one of the few times I remember where we see them like actively getting chased off. Like they don't even get a chance to explain themselves. It's just like, we gotta get out of here.
Yeah. I can't specifically say that Noghri are peace-loving people, because they are tribes that are considered to be like this very severe, nomadic and hunter-gatherer kind of like oriented societies. They're very vicious and proud people. But as far as the Imperials or the Galactic Civil War is concerned, they were kind of like on the side. They weren't involved with that. Right. So I remember the reason that I brought the Tim Zahn's Throne Trilogy, when Leia goes there and, she is being called as Lady Vader, which automatically, that kind of like the wording of it, and they're just like, oh my God, and they almost supplicate in reverence of her. I felt, hold on a second. I felt for Noghri people that they've been slighted by the, obviously, Darth Vader. For those of you guys who've read the book, you might know the exact encounter, what happens there. And I felt for them. They were innocent as far as being involved in this galactic civil war. So I kind of drew a parallel between the two.
Yeah. I think too, in the book that came after that, after Dark Force Rising, The Last Command, when they find the location of the Emperor's, personal storehouse, and the natives there are following them, and they're basically like, look, we just want to destroy the cloning tanks, and the natives are like, okay, but you gotta leave. Like,
so en route to Mara's ship, Jay's Shadow, a Chiss Defense Force patrol intercepts the team, and Commander Irolia demands to meet with Luke. She informs that they require clearance to be in Chiss territory. The group is allocated only 2 days to search the Scylla library for information they require to find the planet. Meanwhile, Jacen Solo befriends Jagged Fell's sister, Win Fell, who aids in their search. She's seen as a threat by rogue Chiss, and she's kidnapping is attempted. Because Jacen saves her, the Jedi gain the leadership's trust and allowed more days to read through the records. Let's talk about the Chiss a little bit. How would you characterize the species in the expanded universe?
I mean, they're like hugely isolationist. Just the fact that we didn't even know their species name for the longest time, because they, other than Thrawn and a few other ones who venture out, they really just stay to themselves, and they have a lot of information and a lot of knowledge, but they're not willing to share it with the rest of the galaxy. So it's like they go to Chiss territory knowing that if they're going to find evidence of where Zonama Sea Code is, it's going to be there, but also knowing that like the Chiss are not trusting at all, and this may be an impossible task.
Here's a follow-up with a somewhat trickier question here. Which particular traits of their culture do you like or dislike?
I like the Chiss, like how very focused they are. I mean, their like culture is really structured to the point of they have, these ruling families, and they have some crazy rules. Like they're non-aggressionists to the point of they have to be attacked first before they'll get involved in any sort of conflict. But I guess I like just how structured they are. Like they can be structured in a bad way, and we've seen that in the books, where just like they're completely unwilling to get involved with something if there's no precedent there. But they're also like really honorable and all of that stuff, and I find that interesting, especially when they come up against humans who are much more loosey-goosey.
Yeah, you basically nailed it. What I was going to add is my first impression of them was, even when, you sort of are introduced to them through Thrawn, if you read that book first, because, chronologically, it was published earlier. extremely proud people, and
Yeah.
they people of their word, and they're so honorable that whether they agree or disagree with your politics or your tactics, it's almost like, even though they're in the unknown regions of space, they are not an unknown factor. If you deal with them and they state to you that this is how things are going to be, this is how we can work together, and we give you our word, you can pretty much trust it, because they always follow with actions. With whatever they said they were going to do, you can rely they're going to do exactly that. So I really appreciated that aspect of their culture. And then we meet Winfell, right? Jagged Fell's sister, a new supporting character. What was your impression of her?
I thought that she was interesting. She was much more talkative than I expected, because, Jag growing up in Chiss culture is very like, I'm not sure I can talk about my feelings. And so he, has issues where Jane is the one like jumping into things, and he's the one, but orders. And Win was a surprise to me, because Win just like talked about whatever she wanted to talk about, and she at least had enough of a filter to be like, oh, I'm not supposed to say that. But she was much more open than Jag, which I found a surprise.
Yeah, when you first read on Jagged Fell, you almost, since you don't know him at first, you feel what he is, the front that he's presenting is what all Chiss are like very reserved, very cold and calculating. But then you begin to separate between the culture and an individual, and you start realizing, no, that's what he is. And these are sort of insecurities that he's personally dealing with her. And like you said, his sister is such a contrast that you start saying, okay, she's also human, that was raised among the Chiss, but she's this way. Yeah. So their culture is very multifaceted, and individualism is welcomed there. And they're not going to be like these cold, hard, like automatons and like, oh, we just follow one order, one rule. They're very, very colorful people. Do you think there was a possibility of a romance between her and Jason Solo? And would that be appropriate for the story?
I don't know, because at the same time, we had a scene in this book between Jason and Danny where they were talking about stuff, and it basically looked like, oh, is something going to happen? And then, of course, they get interrupted. So I think that Win and Jason definitely had rapport, but I guess we don't get her exact age, but she seems to be like a mid-teen. I was guessing maybe like 14, 15, that age. And I just feel like Jason's experiences he's gone through have made him, old beyond his years. So I think they had a great rapport, but I'm not sure I could see Win and Jason, just because I feel like there's almost that gulf of experiences between them, even if the age difference isn't that great.
Yeah. Plus, I would say that from the perspective of Jason Solo, Danny Key is a more desirable woman, because she's the type that would stimulate his, amorous feelings, because she's very well read. She's obviously a scientist. She also had great experiences, good ones dealing with being a scientist, and bad experiences dealing with the Yuzong Vong. And there's a lot more relatable things, right? When you read up an exciting, adventurous story, it's always the tense situation, and when two characters are put together and they survive an extreme situation, it kind of pulls them together. So there's a lot more ground for the Danny Q's case rather than Jagged Fell sister. You're absolutely right there. Jason shifts focus and presents a new idea during their search. He says, what if this planet we're searching for is disguising itself as the moon? Something we haven't accounted for before. And the party puts their minds together, and they determine that their quarry is orbiting a gas giant called Mobus. Jason Solo causes as many problems as the solutions he presents during key moments in the story. Do you think his personality made him a more relatable character than Anakin Skywalker from the prequel trilogy?
Well, I think Jason tries so hard, and Jason has failed. Like, we've seen him fail. And I think that was instrumental to him growing as a person. And with Anakin Skywalker, it's almost like Anakin Skywalker was the wonder child. And like, he's so good at what he does in the Force, but then he has all that emotional trauma affecting him. And so I feel like it's almost like sometimes with Anakin, I wonder, like, what could Anakin Skywalker have become if the Jedi treated him differently, if he was raised differently, if basically, like, what could Anakin have achieved if there wasn't a Sith Lord lurking like a spider manipulating things? And so I think that Jason, in my mind, I feel like Jason achieves so much and like does so much, and I don't know if it's because, he doesn't have that traumatic emotional stuff that his grandfather did. That means that, he maybe has a harder time of learning things, but I feel like he learned so much more than Anakin in the end.
And obviously you had only the span of 3 prequel movies to interact with Anakin Skywalker and see him. There's only so much development that could have possibly happened there. Right. And of course, we get the Clone Wars TV show, which expands greatly upon it. But I would make the case that we live with Jason Solo through many more years of his life, and the books cover so much more details that both the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars show could have possibly covered.
Yeah,
because you get so much details in the book.
We saw Jason from the time he was a baby.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And but I would say that what made Anakin Skywalker less relatable to me is that it's very kind of on the rails story where this child prophecy and then the Jedi Order, despicably so, put so much stress and strain and expectations on him. He's possibly the chosen one. Like, oh my God, and he was kind of like, was just on this spiraling down road with no return. He's a traumatized slave boy that he's separated from his mother, and then all these expectations. Where else do you think it was going to go?
Yeah.
Where with Jason Solo, it's like the avenues are open. He had a happy, bright, adventurous childhood full of experiences, and then when this war comes, he had so many ways to demonstrate the strength of his character in so many different situations, and nobody was there behind the shoulder just whipping him. This is what you're supposed to do. No, here is a war. It came to our doorsteps, and deal with it however you choose.
Yeah. I think if any of the Solo kids had that like weighty expectations placed on them, it was maybe his brother Anakin, who is like having to live with the fact that he's named after his grandfather who fell, and then up to Anakin's death in Star by Star, everyone saw Anakin as like the bright hope for the future of the Jedi Order, and like that's a lot to live up to.
Absolutely. And as we mentioned earlier, we see both twins, Jason and Jaina, developed thoroughly across many, many books. Do you find Jason's personality, based on the Young Jedi Knights series, and his character progression believable in the New Jedi Order series?
I mean, the Jason of the Young Jedi Knights is a silly jokester. He makes the dumbest dad jokes, and he loves animals. And by the time we get to the New Jedi Order, he's obviously an older teen now, but he's so like philosophy, the will of the Force, that there are times where I go like, hey, what happened to that jokey kid who's got like a hamster in his pocket?
Yeah.
But I think, if anything, the events of the Yuuzhan Vong War show you how someone could go from being that, this kid to an adult who has to do adult things.
But I still felt throughout the course of the New Jedi Order, they were kind of like sampling ideas and character concepts, kind of like your temperament that stays with you throughout your life. I mean, right when you in early childhood, when you observe kids, if you have like nieces or younger siblings, and the way that their personality is, a lot of those traits carry over regardless of future experiences. And it's always Jason's this very inquisitive mind, and the notion that he always tempers, like he always pokes the boundaries of whatever it may be. I'm talking about conceptual boundaries, like, oh, I can't mind control animals. Let me go try to do that. Like, it's always that inventiveness and natural curiosity that he had. It always shows. And that specifically, I wanted to illustrate that scene where he proposed to the entire team. It's past even Luke's mind. And Luke is not a dogmatic Jedi. He's not the Jedi from the, Clone War period. He's a lot more open-minded. And yet he is not able to come up with this idea. It's Jason who proposes that. So it was really cool. Moving on with the story. Han, Leia, their daughter Jaina, Jagged Fell, and Tahira Vela arrive at Bakura to offer them a place in the Galactic Alliance to fight the Yuzong Vong. The planet is in a revolutionary upheaval. Prime Minister Kundertol's kidnapping seeds an unrest among the locals. Eventually, he escapes his captors, and the culprit, Senator Melinza, is arrested. However, he's the one who sold the planet out and the Shiruvi Imperium in exchange for turning him into a human replica droid. His aide, Blaine Harris, is another rogue element who plots to bomb the area with a consecration that would take place. The book shifts gears and smacks the plot with a heavy layered politics. We got bizarre consecration ritual, rivaling Puek tribes and Bakuran government, and 3 key rogue elements playing their own games. Was such a departure from action suitable choice for the second book in an overall trilogy, meaning the shift from action to politics riddled story?
I mean, on the one hand, I did think it was interesting bringing Bakura into the mix, which we honestly hadn't seen since the Truce of Bakura, and that was set right after Return of the Jedi. Like, Melinza's mom, Gariel Captison, she came back in the Corellian trilogy and died. Poor little orphan kid. So it was one of the things where, like, we're going to Bakura, and I was like, oh, well, I mean, we haven't heard from Bakura in a while, so what's going on there? Although I will say, we get to Bakura, and the answer is a lot is going on there. I found that with the political, like, scheming stuff, that Jaina is the one on the surface of Bakura, while the rest of them are, like, up there waiting. And honestly, Jaina is out of her depth here. Jaina is her father's daughter. She is not politically minded like Leia. She cannot navigate all of this. So I guess the moments that I appreciated most on the Bakura bits were the ones where Jaina just, like, finally reaches the end of her patience and it's like, what's going on here? Because sometimes I felt like that. Like, what is going on here?
So to follow up with my question, did you enjoy all of that layered intrigue or no?
I mean, I'm not sure I did. I felt like the revelations, especially once they started to build on each other, I was like, whoa, this is getting bonkers. Like, I think it's one thing to realize that, like, the Poeks haven't gotten, their independence from the Saruk, and this was a Saruvi plan all along. But then to have, and the prime minister was in league with them, and he had them, use their integument to put his mind in a human replica droid. And all I could think is, like, I didn't even know we still had those.
And guys, we didn't even get to the good stuff here. Just hold on.
There's some more.
Stuff is coming up. That's why I was so excited to talk with you about this particular book, because I would say more or less when we were discussing New Jedi Order, I sort of halfway expected some of your reactions. Like, it seems like you and I, we have, I would say, different tastes of what we like in the books, but we are consistently seem to be on one side of the argument for the series in general. But this is the book where things are so dramatically, vastly different. I'm like, I can't wait to hear what she's going to say. This is so exciting. So just to push forward a little bit on the story here, Jaina breaks out Senator Melinza. She gets to hear her side of the story, and she's brought to a rebel group where the group is betrayed yet again by her fellow member, Erodian Salkelly, and the captives brought to the Blaine Harris. more intrigue, more
Yep.
plot twists upon plot twists. At what point did the book start feeling like it's a James Bond novel?
I mean, I think once we get to like, they've been betrayed by, betrayed and brought to the rebels and then betrayed by one of the rebels. And then it felt like Blaine Harris was all he did feel a little bit like when you get to the part in a Bond movie where the Bond villain is monologuing and telling you what they're gonna do, and Jade is like, "We gotta stop this." I was like, "Ooh,
it's very pulpy, right?
It's very pulpy."
Yeah. But I personally, I don't know about yourself or our viewers, but when I go to a new book or a new show or a new movie, I generally don't have any particular expectations. I don't have any check marks that a story needs to fulfill to be good. I like to be led on in a story. And as I go along with it, if it's effective, if it's interesting, I buy it. If not, I still finish the story. There hasn't been a single book that I have not finished. And then at the end, I say, well, that wasn't really worth my time. Now, you're dealing with the type of story that you have here in the middle of this trilogy. Did you enjoy actually reading? Did you try to like puzzle out the pieces of it or identify who the real bad guy is going to be, or, in such a political detective kind of story?
Yeah, well, I had honestly struggled with Remnant with the previous book because I just felt like there were some bits where I was like, where is this going? And I felt like Refugee, I found a quicker read, but I do feel like it reached the point where I was like, when we've had a twist on a twist on a twist, and I'm like, I can't predict where these twists are coming from anymore. So I'm still reading, but it's like, I don't know what the authors are going to throw at us next. I guess I felt rather like Jada there, where we get, a revelation and then a counter revelation and then a counter revelation. And she's just like, what?
Yeah. Here, I tend to agree with my younger brother. We came out watching the last Mission Impossible movie yesterday. We generally all loved it. It was really enjoyable, really fun. Have you seen it?
I have not seen it yet.
All right, so I won't talk about anything about the story, but there was one point that he was making. He said in these kind of espionage stories where they sort of depend on the twist, he always feels that less is more. He said, stick with one major plot twist, with one major bad guy, like, or turncoat or whatever, and that makes for a more impactful story. I tend to agree with him. So when I was reading it, I'm not even going to pretend to recall what specific feelings it gave me, guys, because it's been literally over a decade since I read it. I'm relying here entirely on Meg to tell me what those specific scenes are, and then some of them I kind of begin to recollect. But in these sort of situations, in this very story-heavy element, I kind of just go along with it. And early in my reading, when my English was very poor and I wasn't very well read as far as science fiction and fantasy is concerned, because there was nothing else to compare this book to and say, well, this is on a higher tier, or this accomplished the story much more effectively than this book, I was just along for the ride. Yeah. You know what I mean? I was very, I consider myself a very lenient Star Wars fan. I can see the faults and see how they detriment the story here and there. But in general, I would say, what? I'm along for the ride. Let's see who the bad guy is at the end. So that was my take on it. Elsewhere on Bakura, Tahiri Vela investigates Prime Minister Kondratol. I mentioned there's going to be more. She's still dealing with her grief, losing her lover Anakin Solo, and she's feeling personally responsible for his death. Han and Leia help her come to terms with it and reveal what caused her in a conflict. The culprit is a suppressed identity of a Yuzong Vong called Rena Quad that was implanted into her psyche when she was a Vong captive in the previous books in the New Jedi Order. And this identity was held back during her brief romance with Anakin and resurfaced after his traumatic death. It takes a good portion of New Jedi Order series for Tahiri to come face to face with her emotional tormentor, the Vong alter ego. Was this scene worth all the anticipation for you?
I think for me, I had sort of, I don't want to say guessed it, because I don't think I guessed it, but I'd sort of anticipated it. Like, I knew it was coming. So there was a certain part of me that, like, every time we have Tahiri, you know, have one of her dreams where she's running through the world ship on Merkur and she's being chased by something. And there was a part of me that was going, you're being chased by yourself.
Yeah.
And so, and I felt too like Han and Leia and Jaina are trying to help her through this, but I also felt like there were times where Tahiri just seemed like so lost and alone that I really wanted someone to reach out to her and help her and maybe speed this up. But I guess the whole point is if the terror you're dealing with is a part of you, that's something that really only you can confront. So I guess it was more, you know, they were just trying to give her the space to figure her stuff out.
Yeah. I find it a very fascinating story device where the author tells the reader what's really going on, but the character itself, herself, is not informed of what's happening, and obviously causing all the grief here. It's a very interesting irritator in a good sense, because you as a reader, you kind of, if the character is well established and they're good and you're rooting for them, you want them to get to the truth, like, oh my god. And if the storyteller, if the author is very effective, he could lead you on and keep that tension mounting and mounting as far as he can possibly push. And that to me is a characteristic of an effective story. But did you find this was a proper moment, or should this event happen early in the series?
I don't know. I'm not sure, because I don't think I would have wanted it to happen like immediately after what happened to her in Rebirth. Because then, you know, well, no, that was not Rebirth. It was the one before Rebirth. Conquest. Yeah. Didn't want it to happen in Conquest. And then Rebirth is like, you know, the beginnings of her relationship with Anakin, and star by star she loses Anakin. It did feel to me a little like she was on the back burner for the authors after that, that, you know, we saw her briefly in Dark Journey. She is there in the second book of the Enemy Lines duology, and I liked her being included as Luke's, you know, mission to the terraformed Coruscant. But it did feel sort of like they had more important things to focus on. They wanted to focus on Jaina, they wanted to focus on Jason, they wanted to focus on the war effort, and it was like, oh well, now we have time to dedicate to Tahiri. And I guess maybe I would have liked to see not her realizing, you know, that she's got Rena inside her, but maybe like hints of that trouble she's going through before it popped up in the first book here.
Yeah, and guys, just an obvious reminder, right? We're dealing with such a big publishing campaign of 19 books, multiple authors, you know, across several years of publishing. And, you know, if one author is writing one book, you might argue that it's a more organic way of working, because, you know, he's the one who controls all the facets of the story. When you're dealing in the creative group of people who have this concerted way of telling one coherent story, they almost have to treat characters as a roster and say, well, in this book, we're going to bring this character to the foreground, accentuate them more, they're going to have their spotlight. And I feel that most of their side characters that people kind of like sympathize with, they got their spotlight in this series. They were brought to the forefront at one point or another. But, you know, with case of Tahiri Vela, I felt that whether through accident or whether through intent, keeping her dealing with this issue up until this point was effective, because it helped me personally to relate with her. And you always want characters in fiction or in literature in general who are constantly overcoming obstacles and dealing with things.
Yeah.
If you're just a Superman flying through blue, clear sky, like, who the hell cares, right? You want people stumbling and achieving and overcoming. And when, you know, they get to the result, get to that achievement, win the day at the end of the story, you're there, you feel so elevated, and there's a weight off your shoulders, and you feel, oh my God, I'm so happy I spent all these years reading these books, because the payoff is really worth it.
Yeah.
let's move on. So Tahiri leaves Han and Leia and tracks down the Prime Minister. With help, she saves Jaina and the Senator Melanza, along with the rebel group, defeating their opponents Harris and Seckley in the process. But wait, more intrigue. There's a bomb that will go off soon, potentially killing many in the process, and Tahiri rushes up to stop it. Unfortunately, she fails. The explosion takes out the Prime Minister, the planet is indeed consecrated, and then second Siruvi invasion at Bakura begins. How much intrigue and plot twists is enough to keep the story fresh and exciting for you?
I mean, I feel like I sort of have to agree with what your brother said, where if you're doing like a twisty tale, you really want like one big twist, and then when you have more twists than that, you almost get whiplash because you're like, oh, this, and then this, and then this. And so for this one, not just having the bomb going off, like she fails, the bomb goes off, however many people are killed, but then like the Saruk start attacking, and they've got their ships, and they're like dragging people in, and they're gonna attack them, and you're just like, this is a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you as a reader, even when you're spending hours in a fictional universe, you need time for respite.
Yeah.
Right? You need time to absorb the story and emotionally like parse yourself. Oh, okay, I'm rooting for this character. I want this guy to really die. He's nasty. And when more information, more characters, more plot twists are being barraged at you, like at one point, like you might stop caring. You're at the risk of losing your audience.
Yeah, it's almost like, you've got plot overload at this point.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way of putting it, plot overload. But wait, guys, we're not done. So George Lucas is often quoted his famous line of saying, when it comes to repeating motifs in Star Wars, that it's like poetry, it rhymes. Could you say the same for the second invasion of Bakura? Obviously, we had the first invasion in the Truce Bakura novel, and now we see the second invasion in this novel. Is it like poetry? Is it intentional?
I mean, I'm not sure. I feel like it's an explanation, because you're sort of like, they beat the Saruk years and years and years ago, and you're like, okay, but like, what's happened to them since? And so the answer that they've been, gearing up for Bakura Invasion Mark II makes a lot of sense, but also it's a lot to have in like the last third of the book. Mm-hmm. To just have, all of a sudden like ships everywhere. You're like, whoa. Mm-hmm. It's almost the kind of thing where my personal preference is I like when things get a little bit of lead up. Right. Instead of just, everything happening in one book. Mm-hmm. But this is not that book.
Did it have as much impact as the Truce Bakura novel?
Not for me, no, because part of what I liked so much about the Truce Bakura was that we had the Imperials and the Rebels working together. It was like one of the first examples of showing like the Emperor's dead, Darth Vader's gone, like, maybe we'll be able to figure out how to work together and get past this. And like, that's the only way they're able to defeat the Saruk. I mean, well, they have like Luke as their, in reserves. But I just love that, like, people working together. And here there's not any of that, because it's just Bakura and, Han and Leia and their group happen to stumble upon it, and they end up helping them defeat them in the end. But mm-hmm. it didn't have that same feeling to me. It was like, well, that's a way to end the Saruk, but I guess it didn't have the same emotional impact as the original novel did.
Mm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I would say the novelty of the first book, and obviously at the specific time that it came out, like I would argue that although story-wise, the early Bantam era books were playing it safe as far as the main characters are concerned, I personally think those books are pillars for establishing early canon and giving us a first full taste of what Star Wars stories could look like outside of the films. And Truce at Bakura was absolutely awesome to me. I mentioned earlier to you that I was very intimidated coming to America and going to Barnes & Nobles and seeing that giant science fiction section. I didn't want to start off with authors who are potentially regarded by masses as mediocre, because I would spend valuable hours on reading science fiction. There's some better stuff out there. Right. But I took a chance with the Truce at Bakura. It was the first Star Wars book I ever read, and I was absolutely fascinated with Shiruk. I was kind of looking over my shoulder thinking, have these sorts of lizard, dinosaur-like sentient aliens been done before? Or is it Star Wars boring from somewhere else? And at one point I said, you know what, I don't care. They're freaking awesome. Yeah. The war is awesome. Bakura Planet, the whole spiel of the New Alliance dealing with this post-war Imperial Remnant. Like, hold on a second, this is Imperial Remnant? And they're working with a... Oh my God, I could never have accounted for such an interesting scenario, but they made it very plausible in the story. And that's what I really like. And now when we revisit the planet and revisit the alien species, and they kind of try to put it in a slightly different narrative plot in a greater scheme of this intergalactic war, what I do personally enjoy is when a specific story made an impact on me, whether it's specific locations, exotic alien species, story-wise, sub-characters, subplots, when that is being brought back after a number of years, it's such a powerful effect. Like, oh my God, hell yeah. Like, to bring up an example, you and I talked about this before, Troy Danning's Swarm War trilogy, which happens after the New Jedi Order. Some of the characters that he pulls out of Kevin J. Anderson's and Rebecca Muesta's Young Jedi Knight series and puts them in his trilogy. Like, oh my God, this is so epic. This is so cool. It makes up for such an exciting story.
Yeah.
Let's start wrapping things up here. It turns out that the local Perk tribes were Shiruk invaded slaves all this time. Oh my God. Yeah. The Alliance seems to lose grasp of the erupting battle, but the enslaved turn on their masters and bring victory at the end of the day. The dead Prime Minister isn't quite dead yet.
No.
Kundratol reveals he is alive, executes his traitor Harris, and flees the scene. Jaina pursues but fails to stop him, injuring him, the fast-running Prime Minister, by severing his arm, revealing, oh my God, that he's a human replica droid. Again, so many twists and turns. At what point does your head start spinning and say, I have enough of this book? Were you able to finish it in one go, or were you just like putting it aside, like saying, I need a rest?
I mean, the no chapters, which continued from book one, were a little hard for me to feel like I had a natural resting place. So there were bits where I would almost be like, all right, let me get to the end of a part. But then there were parts, I'd get to the end of part 2 or whatever it was and be like, oh boy, this is a book. Yeah. And I think what killed me too is not just learning that Kundratol is a human replica droid, but then he goes and meets with his Saruk, the Saruk that he's been communicating with.
The accomplices, right? Yeah.
And it's revealed that has been a use involved in like a cloaker to make him look like a Saruk all along, because after he kills Kundratol, he like removes the cloaker, and all I could think is, Saruks are dinosaurs, they have tails. How does an Oogolith cloaker give you a tail?
Yeah, but Meg, can we flip it on the side for now? Like, we've been looking at this book from this angle now.
Yeah,
but could we make a case that what the co-authors were trying to do here is utilize the familiar elements that were established in the expanded universe before, which, for our audience who are primarily canon fans, this is your example of case how interconnected the expanded universe really was. And now, here is the case. What they're doing is they're using established lore and characters, and now they're trying to build the intrigue around that by injecting new concepts there. Like, ooh, by the way, the Shuruk are not really Shuruk, they use Zangvan. Why? Because we told you before that they have all these disguised kind of like technology that they can do. And, the invasion, the Prime Minister is really a droid because it's not really out of blue. We saw what Luke encountered and fought against, right, in the original Truce at Bakura. So could you make a strong case that these authors were effectively using but subverting our expectations.
Yeah, it felt to me like they were taking things that had, not really been used since the Bantam era. In book 1, it was the Yevitha. In book 2, it was the Siruk, and being like, hey, well, I mean, these were big, powerful things. Why didn't these come to play up to now in the Yuuzhan War? And being like, well, with the Yevitha, it was genocide. The Yuuzhan wiped them out. And here it's like, oh, well, the Yuuzhan manipulated them to start a war with the Bakurans to wipe themselves out. So it's almost like adding that like pulpy spy intelligence plots into these like existing Star Wars cultures.
And when we say pulpy, if I may speak for both of us, I think that's a good thing in general.
Yeah,
right? Because Star Wars
is very enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, Star Wars, George Lucas based it on the pulp kind of like era, right? The original Star Wars movie was supposed to be a Buck Rogers movie, a project that never got the green light. And George said, well, I'm going to go write my own science fiction story in vain of the pulpy stuff that he grew around with as a kid.
Yeah.
I want to, if we may, do something I haven't done before. I kind of like hit pause on this book discussion and have a general question, which relates to my previous question, but to greater Star Wars, expanded universe, and current lore, the canon. So we just showed you an example of how authors were pulling from the existing material and extending that story and perpetuating it into the future projects. Now, I don't know on which side of the camp you are. I know both you and I read Star Wars Legends, Star Wars canon. We seem to enjoy both. What if this kind of trend continues, if even though Lucasfilm and Disney decided that the expanded universe will be rebranded into Legends, and we're not rewriting anything as far as that is concerned? It's going to stay intact. Fans go out there and enjoy it to its full capacity, and you will know that nobody has tampered with it. Meaning it exists in its original state, and it will forever be that way. We're doing with canon, they're saying, well, we want to start from clean slate. And that seemed to be the trend early on. And I think it was they made a strong case with it, with books like, Lost Stars and Master and Apprentice and all these wonderful books that came out. But slowly but surely, they started pulling material from expanded universe. Once again, not tampering with it, but saying, ooh, it was such a cool concept, such an interesting character. As we saw, one huge case was with Admiral Thrawn, right? They invited Timothy Zahn back into writing stories for the canon, and they took this actual character, transplanted him from Legends into canon via the Rebels show. Now, are you the type of fan that would applaud, current Del Rey and the story group to extract more stories from the expanded universe and say, well, you know what, these stories had so much merit and they're so interesting, let's put them into canon? Would you be up for that?
I mean, I think for me, it depends, because I think taking Thrawn, upplanting him from the Thrawn trilogy and putting him into Rebels, that really worked for me. I thought Thrawn made a very cool antagonist, and I love seeing him face off against it. But I think what I enjoy about pulling things from Legends and putting them into the new canon is when they're different. So it's not like, oh, you're taking this character and they have the same backstory and then the same things will happen to them. I mean, we've already seen that with Thrawn in Rebels, that getting catapulted off into the unknown regions because of space whales was not what happened to him in the Legends stuff. And because there's so many characters in Legends, like my girl Mara Jade, that I love, and I would love for someone like Mara Jade to show up in new canon, but I wouldn't want her to have the same fate as original Mara. And I think too, I understand rebooting Star Wars because, fresh slate, tell new stories. But I also like when there are new stories to be told. Like, I think the idea of the High Republic project is really cool, because that's like an era that they didn't really ever cover in Legends. And so it gives you that opportunity to have new characters and new villains and new stories. And I think those are very interesting. So I guess, yeah, pull Legends characters into new canon, but do something different with them. I don't want just like the same old, same old.
See, you answered my second question also as well. You know, I'm like-minded like you are. You know, when I was working in a comic book store, I heard so many interesting discussions where a lot of fans enjoy the reboots of Marvel and DC Universe, and new authors and artists come in and put a fresh spin on their beloved characters. And others are adamant, well, this is not how it used to be. This is not what I enjoy. And what would you say to fans who are just adamant about the expanded universe and say, like, Disney, don't touch it, you know, with your dirty paws, you know, this is how it's intended to be? And is it reasonable for fans to say, like, don't ever use these characters again? I wonder if you're going to use Thrawn or if you're going to use Mara Jade, she needs to be precisely 100% exactly how she was in the original lore that previous authors put their hearts and souls into those characters, and what you're basically doing is plagiarizing. What would your response be to those fans?
Well, for those fans, I would just say that, like, you know, there is so much Legends content out there, like, you know, over 100 books, how many comic books, just like so much stuff that you can revisit. And I'm even finding, you know, I read a fair bit of Star Wars stuff back in the day, but there's so much stuff that I missed. And I feel like having a character, you know, just reappear exactly as they were in Legends, like, I would rather see a different take on them than, because I feel like even within Legends, you know, how Timothy Zahn wrote Mara Jade is not how other authors wrote Mara Jade.
Right.
And he did create her, but then she went on to almost become another character beyond his original conception of her. So I think, I don't know, I just feel like taking them like wholesale, not changing anything and plopping them into new canon, just, I don't find interesting. And I don't feel it's disrespectful to the authors who created them, because even within Legends themselves, like, no one author writes every character exactly the same.
That's an excellent point. And, you know, if you're a more lenient fan like myself, you are easily, like, you're more open-minded about different treatments of, let's say, Mara Jade that we're talking about, or Jason and Jada described in different books. Or I can totally understand people who say, well, no, I feel I can connect with this version of Mara better, and I felt that this author later on misused the character somehow. That's fair game too. You know, we're not supposed to be, you know, it's not one glove fit all. Even within the context of just the expanded universe, the original Star Wars content, you could say, you know what, this book appealed to me, this one kind of sucked, this one I didn't care for. It's all good game. The one idea that I don't understand is, if you know this, because we want for more stories, because we want to feel excitement again, we want to live with these characters, and when we want the anticipation of the outcome in the story. And if somebody completely replicates what you already know and doesn't put a spin on it, doesn't make it fresh and interesting, what's the point? You're not adding anything to those characters. That's indeed, to me, the highest form of plagiarism. You're basically saying here, this is Mara Jade, and Tim Zahn created her. We're just going to go here, and let's say Dave Filoni convinces Kathleen Kennedy and Disney, you know what, I'm going to do a legit Thrawn trilogy. And from the moment the credits roll, you're going to know exactly the ending to the entire trilogy. Only you're going to have to wait 5 or 6 years for the whole project to come to life, to fruition. What's the point?
Yeah.
Like, what's the idea? So I never got that. So I wanted to hear your thoughts there. All right. Back to our book here. I promise there is going to be more, and there is yet more. Our human replica droid prime minister is shocked to discover that the Shiruvi general is in command, and it's actually Yuzong Vaughn, who stops the droid in his tracks and kill him. He just disables him with the remote controls. He's like, you ain't going anywhere. Pom, and he kills him. Fortunately, Tahiri Vela survived the blast, the earlier bomb blast that we talked about, by creating a force bubble around her, and goes immediately into coma in the aftermath. Oh, she loses conscious. I'm sorry. Many fans enjoy epic fantasy and sci-fi with intricate plots. New Jedi Order is an epic series. We both agree on that. Do you prefer your military espionage and suspense deeply layered with intricate subplots, or enjoy a straightforward story? I'm kind of like reiterating when we spoke about the concise story.
Yeah. I guess the thing is, like, political stories, which I found when I was rereading all the prequel era novels that came out last year, political stories are not my thing, because sort of like that's like levels and levels of intrigue upon intrigue, and I guess I lean more towards the side of just give me a straightforward one, just give me like a one twist and a lot of pew pews.
Yeah,
that's what I enjoy the most.
Yeah. I've read epic fantasy before Game of Thrones came out. As a matter of fact, one of my friends at my store, the same comic book store, came over years before the show was even announced. This Polish guy, and he was telling me, Ben, if you enjoy epic fantasy, man, you got to read this dude George Martin. He's like, Ice and Fire. This is series. That's what it's called, right?
Song of Fire and Ice.
Song of Fire and Ice. Sorry, thank you. And he was saying, you got to read this series. It's so epic, so cool, and so layered. And I was gonna try to get to it, but unfortunately, I just couldn't make time before the show released. But I was reading stuff like this prior to Game of Thrones, where the narration takes place simultaneously from different points of view, from different families or different factions, or a hero and a villain, and they continuously continue the story all together all at once and effectively shift from one view to another. And I just found it always super fascinating.
Yeah.
And we got that in the New Jedi Order. And I said, oh my God, the Imperials, they have their old established remnant here. And, all these Moffs are vying for power. And now this new element comes into play, these invaders. And now they're forced to work together hand in hand with the new alliance. And now there is a Happen fleet. And there's a third party over here. It was so interesting. And then Han Solo's cousin, who with this whole what is called
Thraken.
Thraken Solo in the station, what was called
Center Point.
The Center Point station, like so many different intriguing elements. I was in awe. I was like, oh my God, give me more. I want more. But just in the span of one book, sometimes even that could feel like a little bit too much.
Yeah.
But in general, would you say that this particular book, accomplished what was set out to do?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for the Jedi group, they finally have where they think Zonama Seacoat's going to be, and they're going to go there in the next book. And we got to learn a little bit more about the Chiss. Jason got to figure things out, which is always fun. And then, we got the Nominor plot line advance further with him, not just having shamed ones as part of his heresy, but now drawing in, people from the priestly class as well. And then, Han and Leia's plot line continues to, I guess I would say, wrap up old ends from the Bantam series. And so, they figure out this thing on Bakura, and now they're like, human replica droids, what's next?
Yeah. And for me, it definitely was the greatest push forward in the overall story was Tahiri Vela and her revelation. And finally, we come to understand what's going on there. Let's talk about the unorthodox use of the Force, specifically the Force bubble. Was it cool?
I thought it was cool. I feel like Tahiri has shown that she, because of her experience with the use involved, has like different Force skills at this point. In the second Enemy Lines book, she showed that she can almost like turn off her Force sense, that she can just like vanish in the Force like a Yuuzhan Vong did. So like to me, the Force bubble almost seemed like if she can pull it in, then she can also push it out.
Expanded,
so I thought it was pretty cool.
Did it age well, especially in contrast with the sequel trilogy and stuff like, like force Skyping and indeed physically transporting material from one space to another, right? Remember the Kylo Ren's head gets
like
wet from the rain, or Yoda when he knocks Luke Skywalker with his stick on the head. Obviously, it's a specter of the Yoda. Like, how did that particular skill age?
I mean, I think within the Legends, when authors did the Force skills, they kept it all like, they were trying to go like, well, what do they do in the movies? And then like extrapolate out from there. And so, I mean, that whole idea of like just summoning something to you, we never really saw that in Legends. I think the monks, the Eighteen monks did that, where it was just, things would appear. But I have to say, compared to the sequel trilogy, I feel like the Force skills in these books are not that out there.
Okay, gotcha. Because we did have, parallel to the novels, obviously we had the video games, right? And the notorious, for example, Force Unleashed.
Yes.
Right? I don't know if you played this game or not, but it's pretty insane stuff that happens there. Yeah. Just insane. It's adorable how some fans just like justify that, but like, Rey Skywalker is a Mary Sue. Like, do tell. Like, let's remember Starkiller and the Force Unleashed.
Oh my! I tried to play that game on the Wii. Don't try to play that game on the Wii.
Yeah, because of the control, right?
The controller. It's not a bad idea.
Yeah. So the book ends with our heroes learning that the next destination is the planet Onadax in the Minos cluster, where they'll reestablish contact with the Galactic Alliance. What are, in your opinion, the book's biggest strengths and weaknesses?
I think its biggest strengths was like how it continued the story, how it like pushed the story out to like these, other locations. And for me, Nominor's plotline was like the high point, because I love that squirrely dude. I want to know what he's up to. I think for the weak point for me was that, especially on the Bakura subplot, that I felt like it was maybe trying to do too much at times. Because I feel like what worked for me was the emotional stuff, like, what Tahiri's going through, and less the like actual explicit plotting that happened.
I also want to make the case for, in general, when you go to New Jedi Order across 19 books, what generally seems to work across all of the books, and I mean every one of them, is the characters. And sometimes it's due to authors who are dealing with a character directly in the novel, but also it's based on the predecessor work. Previous novels, 3 or 4 books before, if this particular character is carried over into your story, honestly, and I don't want to disrespect any authors, I'm not saying they're completely talentless, but you basically are, the course is set, you know where you're going, you got the map in front of you, just keep driving.
Yeah.
That sort of happens. You could also make the case for this book. Let's say if you're the type of New Jedi Order fan that considers this one a lower point of the trilogy, and I've heard such things about this novel, you could still argue that, but the characters are really good. And this particular novel, where you got to give the credit where the credit is due, that they did push the characters forward. They gave us some satisfactory moments here, and stuff happened. And you could say, well, I kind of forget about the less consequential plot here. Like, okay, all they needed to do is discover the location of the planet, and we had to get through all of this ordeal just to show us how cunning and crazy the Yuzong Vong are. Hey, by the way, we got that from previous novels, so you're not really adding much here, but at the very least, you're pushing the characters forward.
Right.
As a part of the trilogy and the larger 19-book narrative, how consequential are the events in this book? Are they mediocre? Are they strong? Or are they completely forgettable?
I felt like for me, they seem to be a stepping stone that, like, this isn't the battle on the world ship of Merker level of like so important. It's more like this is the essential progress we need to get Luke and co to Zonama Seacoast. I would argue that for like Han and Leia and Jaina and Tahiri, like what's going on with Tahiri inside is hugely important, but like what they're actually doing just seems like a side quest. So yeah, I think stepping stone is a good phrase.
A stepping stone, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how much focus you and I both put on Tahiri Vela. A, because we seem to be the fans, but B, because of her specific interactions with the Solo and Skywalker families. Later on, I sort of have a vague idea about the fate of the Jedi because I've read 2 books. I read the overall synopsis, and I did read the Legacy series. Is, you might say she's family now.
Yeah.
Like she becomes family. She's becomes such a crucial, important part of the overall series that you say, New Jedi Order is not only responsible for introducing a whole new intergalactic invaders and new ways and tactics of fighting of war, and the Rebel Alliance like amassing all of their intellectual, spiritual, and like material resources to fight this war, but also it's just showed a very interesting and new characters that come to the forefront and enter our hearts and begin to set themselves as important, I would say, as the Skywalkers and Solos. And this is what I always wanted, like, and wished for when I opened up my first Star Wars book. I'm like, okay, how do we go beyond the movies? Luke Skywalker is great, and I fully understand people who say, you know, the entire Skywalker saga depends, Star Wars saga depends on Skywalkers. Without them, you don't have Star Wars. My case was like, no, you use the same template. Yeah. Use the same motifs. It's not per se Luke Skywalker that is the center of the story. It's the Luke Skywalker archetype. And if you're able to use the same archetype or add more to it and say Luke now transitions from his role as the hero who wins the day into kind of like Yoda character later on in the series, and other central characters like Tahiri Vela become central to the story.
Yeah.
I guess this pretty much nails this very deeply layered story here. Guys, next time we're going to circle back and discuss the final 3rd book in the series and wrap up our New Jedi Order discussion. Any last words, thoughts on this book or New Jedi Order before we say goodbye?
No, I just think that, you know, again, if the New Jedi Order is a series that you've never read, or maybe, you know, you read it when it came out 20 years ago and it's been a while and you're thinking like, I'd like to do a reread, do it. Start with Vector Prime and do it. It's worth it.
I'm sort of entertaining the idea of reading the entire Legends. Ooh. But I think that's too much of a commitment, and I still have about 45% of the books to finish, believe it or not, after all of these years, because I read so much other stuff. I literally have the checklist where they like earlier stuff, like the Knights of the Old Republic era stuff that I have not even read. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us, Meg. It's always super lovely talking to you. We had our laughs. It was so just fun and exciting discussing this particular book. And obviously, most of the time, we do it all in light of things. I don't think we're here to like uber criticize the author and say, well, this is not the Star Wars we were looking for. It's just sometimes things divert and they go in unexpected ways that may work for some fans and may not for others. I have dear friends who just despise this book. I'm like, okay, all right, cool. Let's move on. Anyway, thanks for checking us out, guys. If you enjoyed this discussion, please check out Meg's channel. I'll leave all the relevant links, as always, in the video description. Go check out her channel, her wonderful reviews, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care, everyone. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We endured. Okay, so maybe, hopefully, next week we get to wrap up this trilogy. But I was sort of, once again, I was trying to get ahead of myself and try to figure out what your take on this would be. I'm like, okay, not exactly so. All right, Meg, thanks a lot, and hopefully I'll see you next week. As always, I'll drop this on Monday, okay?
Okay, yeah.
Thanks. Have the wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.